I'm going to start off with, so a couple things. This is the first time I've given this elective, and I'm still sorting out some of my thoughts about some of these arguments. So I kind of could use some like question input, like what I want to get at is basically the set of recent arguments. I feel like we've seen a great deal of emphasis in the past several years on the kind of nature of fiat and its relationship to critical arguments. That is, we see a lot of link arguments about the assumption that we should be debating in a world of should, okay? And criticisms of that interpretation of, you know, our relationship to the resolution, that the resolutional terms establish that should is the basis for how we are debating, okay? And I want to just walk us through basically where are some accounts that we could draw from like how would we begin to construct a theory of why it is that we should continue to use the language of should and to connect should to the assumption of fiat, okay? So just like, what are critically informed defenses of this model of debate? And we'll see if I can satisfy you all and cover some of the arguments that you feel like you commonly encounter. But part of what I want to get at, or what I would be very curious to hear from you all, or questions that might be useful for me, are things that you feel like you hear that, you know, we haven't worked through yet, but like you want to see how they might fit into such a critically informed model of thinking about should. Does that make sense? Okay. I include Spencer and DKP, or you're welcome to participate in that set of questions as well. So I think, you know, I've already used this language of should, okay? And that I'm going to proceed on the assumption that this is where we get the notion of fiat from, okay? And that the should in the resolution, you know, indicates and is contrasted with the language of would or will. Okay. That then this is the notion that we are debating in a way that should be prescriptive rather than descriptive. And I want to unpack a couple of these concepts for a moment and contrast what an alternate theory or world of debate might look like. So first question for you all is like, imagine that we treated fiat or this concept of should dramatically differently, and we treated it as a basis of debating these kind of like would or will, okay? There was actually someone who, there was a lab instructor in the 90s and early 2000s at the DDI who would consistently give an elective on fiat should be will, or fiat should be about probability of something that will occur. So there's like, this alternate theory of debate has been trotted out before. What would such a world of debate look like? Like, how would you go about constructing an affirmative?
They're having a piece of evidence that says, like, this idea is popular or it's moving through Congress now, but like, there's some sort of reason why it's not. Or like, there's a small reason why it's not, but that the push for it to happen overcomes that.
Okay, so we would be debating about inherency as a probability rather than a barrier, right? We'd be thinking about like, what will happen or what we think is likely to happen, okay? What do you think of the features of such an affirmative would be?
You're just like allowed to count unique discards, like it's likely to happen now.
Okay, so we will be debating a lot about kind of current legislation, or obviously legislation is not always the agent of government, or like Congress is not always the agent of the resolution, but just the equivalence of legislation for various branches in government. We would be debating about the likelihood of various outcomes, okay? What would be the character of such an affirmative? Like, if you were drawing from things that, you know, have some degree of probability of occurring and represent current legislative priorities or the likelihood of decisions by the courts or federal agencies, like what would that set of affirmatives look like, for example, on this topic?
Like you could read an advantage about like the motivations of like maybe Trump to pass this piece of legislation.
Okay, and so then like following this a little bit further, like, would the affirmatives that you would defend, they would be more consistent with kind of existing approaches to policy or existing governmental priorities? Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah.
Okay. What is characteristic, like if we add up all of these things together, what is characteristic of a form of debate that does not use a prescriptive? So do we get why this is, when we say descriptive versus prescriptive, do we get why this is a set of arguments that are descriptive if they are trying to assess current probabilities, like they are making observations about the world, right? Is that rather than a prescription about what ought to be done? Yeah. If we were debating in a more descriptive manner and we were thinking about, would or will rather than should, what is the general character of affirmation in this world?
It's not based in a normative, like, saying something is good, rather about, like, describing the status quo and, like, making a prediction about the status quo.
Okay, so AFs that wanted a high probability of solvency then would also be thinking about kind of like high probability of occurrences given present circumstances, yeah? And that character then is one of like, what is it, you summarized this a little bit earlier, so anybody can fill this in. What is its relationship to the status quo?
It follows it pretty well.
I think we would be debating more in terms of inertia. Affirmation would display elements of status quo bias in the sense that we would try to get at things that are relatively close to what is occurring now. They are likely to occur. They accord with current priorities or current manners of thinking. So let's think then about what does debating in the prescriptive get us versus this, like, clearly we could have a version of this, like, do we agree that you could debate in this manner? Like, you could cut cards that said all of these things, yeah? What, given if we accept the notion of should or a kind of prescriptive approach to debate, what are we getting that is different than we would in this world?
Things that might not be happening, or like not, ideas that are not necessarily moving through the government now as they could happen, but still would be like good ideas.
What else? That's all we get.
I guess we're not constrained by the status quo or like what's likely to happen.
Is there a different way to phrase that than like we are questioning status quo priorities?
Not really, no. Or not that.
Are there any other things that we are getting out of this model? What is the role of a debater and a judge if we are trying to assess probabilities and current barriers to action? How are we positioning ourselves?
Or with the descriptive model, we don't have to debate the probability of something passing.
Okay. And so what does that make? Are these roles different? Are we doing something as different as judges and debaters that you could summarize with like who we are or what we're doing?
You have a more active role in should, whereas like you kind of, it seems like in the Wood model, they're like passive and like you're not a part of decision making.
Okay, so you're making the case for how to make a decision, yeah? Like, when we engage in prescription, we are also thinking about how we might make a decision, yeah?
I guess it kind of falls in that one, but like I think political feasibility becomes less.
Do you have a contrasting term for feasibility?
Probability.
I thought probability was over there.
Desirability?
Yeah. Desirability, quality, or advocacy rather than feasibility. Okay, so what do we agree, like, have we gotten some features of our model of thinking about debate in prescriptive terms where it's like, do you see how I've put this in terms of some of the language that we tend to use in describing what it is that we're doing in debate, right? That we are acting as advocates for a particular proposal, that we raise questions about why there are barriers to a set of ideas that are relatively desirable or that we think are high quality but are not being implemented, or they are not being considered or really debated as realistic priorities given the way that the status quo operates. Have I given us a description of what it is that we're trying to get out of should? Okay, now I want to hear some of the are there features of, when we think about the criticism of Fiat, are there any features of Fiat that are currently not up here that we need to include that are going to be the subject of criticism?
The idea of like something being durable, like there will not be changes to the policy when it goes through the process of, or normal means or whatever.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? Any other features of Fiat that you feel like come in for criticism consistently?
It's kind of similar to like the normal means thing, but the actual like ways that it would be implemented, like that's normal means. I'm not sure the way I'm trying to write that.
Okay, right. So like there are certain levels of detail, right, and then kind of the notion of continued feasibility that this model generally. This is, I'm gonna draw a little bit of a line here in the sense that it's like, do we agree that these are kind of added caveats or like added features of Fiat that we will sometimes discuss, but they're not required features of a theory of Fiat. Do we agree with that? Okay, so that's why I'm putting that dotted line there. Okay, let's talk through some criticisms. If we want critically informed defenses of Fiat, I presume that you are here in part because you are familiar with some criticisms that we have of the model of Fiat. Can we list some of those or like engage with a little bit of where those come from?
Like it's too utopian, like we can imagine, like assuming that we have feasibility kind of distracts from what we can actually do or not.
Okay, it's utopian, so it assumes away details or the how, right? Focuses only on the should, the desirability, yeah.
That implementation of policies might be restricted to certain groups of people or not accessible to other groups of people.
There are a number of features that we could add there, right? But like status quo bias, discriminatory, hierarchical, right? There are a number of different features that I think fall in a relatively similar criticism of the way in which policy effects occur, okay, or what we expect of the institutions that are implementing policies. Anything else?
Rule assumed with Fiat is bad, like thinking you can act as the state is bad.
What do you mean by that?
Like, having the agent be the government instead of like
I'm drawing a little arrow up there where it's just like, we can imagine if this is the process of policy assessment, you might think of this as the agent of policy implementation, can be subject to many of the same criticisms. Okay, yeah.
It's unrealistic in terms of time. Like if you're describing a brink argument right now, in Fiat that it has now, it's not realistic to take time to pass in the government.
Okay, that there is a mismatch between desirability and the time frame of likely activity by these institutions. I think we're at least connected there to some of the utopian argument, or at least like that is a danger of making a set of assumptions. Anything else?
It's kind of like the second one, but instead of it being like discrimination based, that like the actual way that it would get implemented, Congress would make amendments, or courts wouldn't rule in the exact way. And there would be things that could change the bill, like through the process of it becoming law or a court decision. That might make it distinct from whatever the original proposal is.
Can I ask what you think is distinct about the category of argument that you're raising that is not covered by this, if we call that implementation?
If it's called implementation, then yeah.
I'm using this phrase policymaking here very broadly in the sense that it would include, so it's like formulation and implementation are both included in policymaking. So I'm gonna put that in there as well. Anything else? Okay. So there are a couple things that strike me about both this set of lists and where we might go with what we're trying to get out of this model. So remember that status quo bias thing. The part that strikes me as, you know, like a real tension that we have to explore in thinking about any of these defenses is, okay, are there political theorists or people who talk about ethics and politics who defend utopians? Several of you are nodding your heads, okay? I think that is accurate to say that there's a lot of evidence that we could cut about that. What would that set of people be talking about that is pretty different from some of the features of our model over here in terms of, like, what aspect of the, oh, sorry, I did this wrong. Oh yeah, okay. Aspects of the model that we're getting out of on this side. What would defenders of utopianism or kind of thinkers about the value of utopianism be thinking about that's a little bit different than the folks over here? Why, if we go find cards that defend the value of utopian thinking, do we sometimes run into difficulties connecting those to a defense of fiat?
Utopian thinkers probably wouldn't, like, their idea of what a utopia is wouldn't be like a single policy or court decision, but rather something that we can, like, an ideal society, and then from there we plan things to get there and like enact change, enact a single thing.
I think this is one of our core difficulties of finding evidence that describes what it is that we want when we are trying to defend a model of the value of using should and fiat as an example of should when trying to think about political thinkers who defend what it is that we are doing in debate, okay? Because this is a really uneasy fit. Utopianism as a kind of like defenses of utopianism, as in, and what's another concept that might be associated with utopianism that we could also find defenses of? Like, what language do we associate with utopianism that also shows up in a number of our debates? I'm fishing for a particular term here.
Mindset shift.
What if I said imagination? Does that work? Okay, so like, do we agree that there are defenses of the importance and the power of human imagination? Yeah. How often are these defenses translated into terms of the kind of desirability or quality of a particular advocate in terms of decision making for the existing set of institutions that we are talking about over here? How often do those things line up? I would say not all that often, right? Or just like, this is a place that it is tricky to find an intersection, okay? Are there many cards that make these arguments? Like, is there a wealth of evidence discussing this set of concepts? Ben, you're nodding your head. Can you give me an example or kind of like think about, describe some of the evidence that you have seen that falls in these categories?
in reference to like specifically in context of a debate, there was a card that, or like a piece of evidence that was talking about Fiat in debate, specifically in the context that, thinking about Fiat as if like it's going to happen and will be durable is what the whole like policy making status quo bias thing, that argument. There's also stuff about like scenario planning or imagination broadly with like the United States federal government or institutions like that is core. Like I think it was the luminosity K, I think last year, the semi-luminous evidence. I think, and other things like that.
Okay. We've got evidence from coaches. We have various criticisms of all of these institutions. We have Ks of envisioning or kind of predicting or trying to establish different scenarios for desirability, things that are oftentimes thought of as features of this model of should over here. Okay. I have a different question for you. So the neg has a wealth of evidence about these aspects, yeah? Which of these aspects are connected to the concept of should?
Probably most the utopian thing,
Aha. Talk me through that.
because it says that, with should as, like, ignoring, prioritizing desirability or feasibility, that is bad, and not necessarily about, like, the status quo.
Okay. I agree with your assessment. It's like, what terms in the resolution, okay, do this set of arguments relate to?
Like, PSG.
They relate to the federal government. They relate to the actor. Do they link to should?
I think the desirability and timeframe kind of does, but the policymaking and institution are specific to the actor itself.
Okay, so we think these are much more about the actor. That's definitely has some connection to the concept. This has some connection to the concept, maybe in the sense that it's like, we are still talking about advocating for things that we might not be able to make happen in a way that's a little bit different than just like assuming away the how. It's like, even with the how, maybe there's a bit of a mismatch in terms of what our evidence describes as desirable and our ability to affect it, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's reasonable. So if that's true, then what is strategically going on in the criticism of Fiat? What's the neg doing here? Like, just walk me through why this set of arguments might be very prominent. So we've tried to set up some of the like, where the evidence comes from, what the evidence says, all that sort of stuff. What are we getting at here? Why is this argument popular on the negative?
It works really well with critiques that critique the state in any way, like settler colonialism. Basically, a lot of critiques.
We have many criticisms of existing institutions, yeah, and because, you know, we can try and, it is to the neg's advantage to treat the criticisms of those institutions as criticisms of a model of debate that is about desirability. Because what is the AF getting out of the model of desirability? What strategic benefit accrues to the AF by being able to use, by saying that we are debating desirability? Or that we are debating prescriptively rather than descriptively? What does the AF get?
I think it pressed the solvency about like potentially having to go back or like implement it in back.
There are a variety of solvency-oriented questions that the AF is permitted to say basically are not negative ground. What else do we get? This was in part of the feature that of the board that I erased. I think of it as a strategic feature, but sometimes we don't.
They don't have to debate the probability of the passage.
Okay, so we get away from all of these arguments about kind of like some of the how would we make this happen.
They don't have to defend something that's like status quo biased.
We do not have to defend, it's like if we put all those things together, one way of phrasing that is we do not have to defend something that is status quo biased or that is really even comprehensible according to status quo terms. That's obviously a very powerful strategic tool, because if part of what we are doing is organizing affirmation versus the status quo, we want the ability to kind of like dodge that set of constraints, okay? this mismatch, or this like unevenness here, is the AF is trying to identify why a certain set of constraints should be combined with a lot of strategic power to avoid constraint. As in, the AF is trying to thread the needle here on, there are certain features, like if this is a debate about the actor, what have we now included in our defense of Fiat?
The United States federal government.
Okay, right? And do we agree here that it's like, that puts the neg in a very different evidentiary place, right? So I have a different question for you is, if the link arguments are to the institutions that are found, that are to the resolutional actor, if we imagine a resolution that was written in the language of should, but didn't use those institutions, how many of the existing criticisms of Fiat would apply? What on the board now applies? Yeah, mostly this one, right? Especially because this mismatch is largely a product of the time frame of the action of those institutions versus the desirability of our particular advocacy, yeah? So we've really concentrated it down to one. I think that a critically informed defense of Fiat, one, tries to separate features that the neg is lumping together. So the model of Fiat, if we derive that from should, we don't derive it from US federal government. So defending a model of should does not have to defend that the actor in debate or that the notion of desirability is connected to that set of institutions, right? So what does it mean now if the neg says we have a link to Fiat?
You have like a link to the institution / actor that does Fiat or does the action.
What does that change about the debate?
I guess it means like our responses to like the quote-unquote Fiat case should not be about the defense of Fiat or ever like maybe a defense of the actor or thinking about the actor.
Are we deciding, so this set of arguments is oftentimes phrased as a critique of this model of debate, right? As in the model of debate is one that accepts the idea that government institutions are desirable, right? And assumes that into existence. We agree? Okay? If we can disassemble Fiat from that set of institutions and argue that desirability is a feature of different parts of the resolution than the actor, then defending the model of debate that relies on a notion of advocacy is different than defending the desirability of the particular institutions that we are assuming would implement the thing that we are advocating. Does that make sense? Meaning, what does that change about how the judge should make a decision if faced with the argument, we have a link to Fiat?
Like, removing, like, I guess the interwovenness between the layers, you can kind of make a decision. You can make clearer arguments about why like a specific portion is desirable, and the neg is probably just going to stand up and say, oh, Fiat's bad because of the institution, and you're saying, sure, the institution is bad, but we're specifically talking about the desirability of the plan itself, and then the judge can have kind of a clearer inroads to defend the AF.
Okay. Does that also mean, so how many of you think that Fiat implies that we must evaluate decisions in a consequential manner? Raise your hand if yes. Like, Fiat means that we are doing consequentialist analysis. Somebody explain to me the connection or why you think that these things are intrinsically connected. Someone who hasn't talked yet.
Because the plan, the plan, the usage of should argues that it would be implemented, and so once the plan is implemented, I guess the link and impact scenarios sort of are the ongoing consequences of the plan.
Okay, so the way that you're saying that is any impact that the affirmative constructs when using a model of Fiat is a consequence of the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah? what if I said that, so for instance, I debated on a topic about sanctions removal, okay? What if I said that sanctions are immoral? They violate deontic morality. They use people as a means to an end. Am I still using fiat? Or do we have a model of debate that is still grounded in the desirability rather than the feasibility of sanctions removal? Okay. Have I made a consequentialist argument? Perhaps these things are not as thoroughly connected as we thought. So how often is it that, do we see how the criticism of this was all about consequences, right? Or largely phrased in terms of consequences, most often, okay? Does that mean, so now, it's not the institution, and it's not the mode of decision-making. So instead of looking for cards that say policy-making good or state good, where would we go for our cards about defenses of fiat?
Like thinking about ethics is good, like how like ethical decision making is like a good practice to engage with.
Okay, so here's my, I agree with you that there are probably some arguments that could be made about decision making and like what are the obligations of a decision maker, so we might find some evidence in ethical theory. Here's my question to you is, how often do you see, like, has anybody ever gone and read any like meta-ethics or like ethical philosophy? I imagine there are some of the LDers in here who have engaged with this, yes? How often do those arguments intersect with an analysis of the, like, remember, we're trying to disassociate it from the institution, but how many of them connected to the notion of advocacy? As in defending the desirability of a particular proposal. How often are those ethical theories discussed in that context? Okay, Thatcher's giving me a big thumbs down. Yeah, this is, I would say this is a reason that this is a hard set of evidence to draw on if this is what we are trying to defend. So, do we have any other candidates? If we're thinking about advocacy, as in like we want to propose something, would that generally fall in the realm of ethics, or is there a different kind of realm that we're really thinking about there? How, what area would we tend to think of as having a lot of advocates? Like intersecting with what kind of area of study?
Like political theory and education?
Politics, right? So like rather than thinking of this, because you know, the modes of decision making, that's the ethics stuff, right? So like deontic ethics, consequentialist ethics, virtue ethics, whatever. There are a whole bunch of different ones that you can go for here, okay? If we go to political theory and we think a little bit about what it means to be an advocate and why, okay? We could also do this in the other major area that you might be able to do this is in terms of rhetorical theory, okay? So like how and why, or argumentation. It's like a subset of rhetorical theory. So like how or why should we argue about things, and in particular, how or why should we argue about things that we are advocating ought to be done, that is, particular distributions of power or different ways of thinking about who gets to do what, why we should do certain things, like those are political questions generally. And we have arguments and evidence that intersects in the realm of politics and, politics and rhetoric. Okay, so that's a set of places that we might go for finding some of these cards. I have one other question here is like, how often, or just like, how often have you ever heard a cross-ex or asked cross-ex questions yourself about, like rather than thinking of this as we are defending policymaking, how often have you asked a cross-ex question about what an alternative model without the notion of should looks like? Like you've been, raise your hand if you have debated a critique that said they had a link to fiat. How many cross-ex questions have you asked in those circumstances about what we should have instead of fiat? Okay. This is part of the strategic imbalance slash like when I'm thinking about what it is that I'm trying to get at in terms of what the takeaway from the elective for thinking about like different strategic categories both for research and for strategy writing. It's like both of these are areas that are very thoroughly unexplored. Most of the cards that people read when faced with any of these questions are about this. Whereas I think that we want to disassemble this and say this is downstream of Fiat. The desirability of particular political institutions and whether or not they can act, okay, is a different question than the one about whether or not we should debate in terms of should. That is, whether or not we should act as advocates. So the links to Fiat, in my mind, are not things that are resolved by, like, if we got rid of the institutional actor in the resolution, would we have removed Fiat from debate? So if the alternative avoids the link to the state, does it automatically avoid the link to Fiat? No. So this whole set of questions, I think as the AF, we would want to treat as downstream. I have a different way of phrasing some of these. So why is it, or can you describe to me some of the frustration with when you read cards about state or law or the importance of state institutions for action? What is the way that the negative usually handles those with a criticism of Fiat? Like, why is it that those cards sometimes don't get the job done? What is their major failing? How often do those cards decide a debate? Like, how many decisions do you get that are like, the AF won that the state is good? Raise your hand if it is above 50, like debates that you have versus critical arguments. Raise your hand if above 50% of your debates are decided on the AF won that the state is good. Some hands, but not a ton, okay? Part of this is the quality of these cards, or kind of like many of these things that these cards discuss. What is an argument about the desirability of those or like, what is a major argument about those institutions that is not covered or that like actually contrasts with this notion of Fiat or desirability rather than feasibility? What is one of the major defenses of using existing political institutions?
Because you can't change them, or you can't like leave them.
Is that an argument about desirability?
No.
It is only an argument about desirability insofar as we consider this, right? It's like, can you get rid of this set of institutions? Could you build an alternative set of institutions? What happens in a world without those institutions? Like, all of those are now back in the register of feasibility, right? Okay, so our defense of Fiat and our defense of the state or the institution that we are defending ought to implement our advocacy. Those should actually be thought of as two different steps. And in particular, given the quality of negative cards about or indicting the set of institutions that we have, right? If we allow those to be criticisms of the entire model of debate that is about should and advocacy, but we don't have like all of our defenses of the state are about feasibility rather than desirability, we are reading a set of cards that actually play into this mismatch. Does that make sense? So our cards about Fiat should be cards about advocacy or the importance of argument and advocacy and how we would advocate rather than cards about the institution. Or they should be cards that explain why it is that we would want this specific set of constraints, right? Like, why accept a constraint? If we're trying to get at something that is about desirability and not feasibility, why would we draw a line at a particular set of constraints? And this is a place where it's like, and I'll try to leave a little time for questions. And this is the place where I'm kind of like least satisfied with some of my own answers, or like have some difficulty turning some of these arguments into, like, this is kind of the, I want us to work through a bit of the implementation of these as strategic ideas. I'll mention a few of them briefly, and I can try and discuss or read some cards that I think might be examples of this. Or the reason I asked the question about cross-sexing about alternative models. I was a little surprised that somebody didn't say that the answer that they've heard to that set of questions or the questions that they've asked rely around the notion of proximity. or like closeness or agency, like what we can currently do. Does that make sense? Have you heard answers that are similar to that? Like, the judge doesn't have the power to do X, but they do have the power to do Y. Yeah? Okay. How many of you have read a card about accepting that set of constraints? What do you think of as an example of that argument?
It's about like why debating is uniquely good because of the discourse in the round, because that's the only real thing, and that because Fiat is like this imaginary construct, the only actual like impact outside of just reading these arguments is like the education surrounding it.
Sorry, that is a very good answer. I think that is the answer for the neg. I was maybe not clear in my question. That's the answer for the negs argument, right? Okay. How many of us have read a card that criticizes the notion that that is a constraint that we should accept? So like, let me put it this way. Do we see how as soon as the neg makes their argument an argument about, well, we should focus on the things that are immediate to us. They are proximate, they are the words that we speak rather than the things that we can't do. What are they making arguments about? Where has the neg implicitly put us in that world?
Institutional thinking? Like, things are like,
Kind of. I'm talking about big, compare and contrast in terms of these concepts. What is the neg argument now about?
/web.
Yeah, and feasibility, right? Like now, the neg, like, do we see how it's like, the neg had initial criticisms about, and how often does the neg make an argument that we should not be status quo biased? As in, accepting the existing limits of these institutions is a thing that is wrong, it is wrong to do. So like, we should not be biased towards status quo institutions. Do we see how that's a mirror image of this mismatch in the other direction? The neg has now made the debate about, implicitly about feasibility, as in, what do we have the power to do in terms of our immediate agency or proximate things that we hear and see, right? Rather than what we might advocate for. Does that make sense? Do we see that like switcheroo? Okay. So part of the offensive argument that we might be looking for is a card that criticizes accepting that set of constraints on how it is that we imagine or argue, right? That we accept as a limitation on argument basically what is in our power as individual agents. How often has the neg read an argument that criticizes the notion of liberal individuality? Ben is nodding his head. Do you all understand what I mean? Like, how often is the criticism of existing set of institutions about the way that those, quote, shape subjectivity or basically teach us to treat what is an agent or how agency works in a very particular way? How often has the neg made that combination of arguments? Pretty often, yeah? This is a place to exploit that mismatch. So criticisms of accepting a notion of individuality as the basis for agency, or proximity as a version of control. So like, how often has the neg also implied that it is bad to think of ourselves as like unified selves who own we own ourselves, we own our ideas, we are unified subjects who are autonomous actors. Like, how often has the neg read a link to that? Very often, okay? This is not, they've almost never faced this quandary, okay, in the opposite direction. The AF basically never reads offensive arguments that say, implicitly, the neg's alternative model for debate has now accepted certain constraints on feasibility that have their own political or ethical consequences because they are models for advocacy that are limiting in terms of proximity and individuality. So if you can win arguments that say it is bad to think about the world and advocate for a world purely in terms of like autonomous individual who can control a limited set of circumstances and exercise agency over those things that are immediately in front of them, like that is offense against that interpretation or alternative to fiat and desirability. Okay? And do we see how it's like those arguments on both sides are now, we are trying to separate them from a set of cards about the desirability of those institutions, because as we said, many of our best defenses of those institutions are actually about the feasibility of getting rid of them, not about their desirability in the abstract. So we want to treat fiat as the upstream issue of like, what are we doing in debate? Why should we, kind of be arguers who are thinking about the world in terms of advocacy or prescription, okay, and criticize certain limitations that might be implied by a model that says you should never think outside of what an individual is capable of doing or proximate to the things that that individual says, or a unified notion of an autonomous individual, often things that the neg has already read criticisms of. So arguments that you can argue apply, that like their criticism of some of the existing institutions links to the set of constraints that they have now implied are a matter for all advocates or all arguers. And downstream of that, we can have an argument about whether or not, as part of assessing the desirability of a policy, we need to consider some measure of the feasibility of the institutions that it could implement it, and whether or not those institutions could be replaced. So that's my big case, is like disentangling those things helps the AF avoid this dilemma, and helps the AF be able to initiate offense or kind of reverse this dilemma in terms of the neg providing an alternative model that may in fact fall prey to some of the same dangers of status quo bias in terms of both its concepts for organizing the world and for determining what we think is feasible or how we think it becomes feasible. Does that make sense? Okay. And I don't have a super ton of time to go into some example cards and I don't think that will actually be all that effective here. I am more interested, like, people can talk to me about some sites or some ideas for what some of those offensive arguments might look like. I will say that I think many of them tend to be focused on, so like, criticisms of micropolitics, okay? Those are oftentimes criticisms of kind of the like, we are acting in terms of our proximity or not using institutions to mediate our action. Criticisms, so the other things like, when somebody mentioned the like ethics kind of component of this debate, how often is the neg phrasing their argument in terms of ethics and ethical commitments? Like, how often have they introduced impact arguments about that? A fair number, okay. Do we see that there are probably people who criticize this combination of a focus on individual ethics and ethical responsibility at the expense of politics? That is, it teaches us to make arguments primarily in terms of its ethical effect on the relationships between individuals or the conduct between individuals. That is, it focuses what we are thinking about the world in terms of individual conduct and codes of conduct, rather than the organization of power or the distribution of power and the way in which institutions organize power or politics. So criticisms of kind of ethics at the expense of politics, okay, notice, some of these also accord with explanations that the AF might have for why we would accept some of the existing constraints on those institutions. So like a realist account in international relations will have cards about why it is that ethics do not provide the answers to most of the important political questions that we have in the world because actors do not obey ethical codes. Like, that is an example of why it is that advocates should consider the kind of political surroundings of advocacy potentially at the expense of ethics, or not believe that ethics provides the answer for what it is that we should advocate or how we should advocate about the world. Okay, that's a different, I'm sorry, I have to speed through a couple of these steps, but that is a different way of linking a bunch of these questions about feasibility and desirability together, also ethics and politics. What I'm trying to get at is there are a number of political theorists who write about the relationship between politics and ethics in a way that gets us back into some of these, like, rather than the defense of the institution, it is a defense of how it is that the advocate should think and why the advocate should think politically rather than solely or primarily ethically. Sorry for the fast data dump at the end there. Questions about this / like where to go looking for some of these cards or what I'm trying to get at here? Go for it.
So could you just like re-explain why the AF only needs to really defend like should, not use if she should?
Because the grounds for thinking of the debate as a debate about should don't depend on the actor. We could write, so like, what if we wrote the topic as like, and people have proposed different agents and different topics, what if we wrote the topic as, should labor unions organize primarily, in the workplace or across the sector? Like, is that is that an argument that now the same set of cards about policymaking institutions, do those apply? I would say no, but we are still using the concept of like should. We are advocating for a different agent. That is, fiat is an assumption that relates to kind of what we say about assuming the agent's power, rather than that we assume that it must be a particular agent, or that we assume that the decisions that that agent makes must be evaluated in a certain way. So the reason I'm trying to disentangle these things is when the neg gets to entangle them, they're suddenly drawing on a huge evidence set and implying that that evidence set settles the question of how it is that the judge should decide, okay? As in, the judge should not decide to evaluate the case, right? That's what the neg is getting at with fiat, is like the case goes away because fiat is the assumption that brings the case into the debate, okay? Whereas the link arguments here are to the actor that is implementing the policy. We want those things to be disentangled because we want this to be a debate that is downstream of how it is the judge is making a decision or what the judge is making a decision about.
So basically, like, you still probably have to spend the actor, but just that case of the actor are not a case of fiat, so therefore still consider the case.
We can still evaluate the case, and most importantly, the cards that we want to read for the desirability of existing institutions are actually mostly arguments about feasibility. That is, they defend it in terms of our ability to get rid of those institutions and replace them, or to revolutionize our society and entirely wipe those institutions away. Like, part of the problem of debating that as though it were a question of fiat is that it doesn't give an answer to why this set of constraints, and that set of constraints is largely an argument about feasibility, not an argument about desirability. So our cards mismatch in terms of the type of thing that we're actually trying to defend. Cormac.
So given this, if the negative reads state bad disad on move the plan framework, would you argue? Sorry.
No. Keep going.
Would you argue that like that's not a reason not to weigh the plan, and if so, how would you articulate that?
Okay.
The 1A or 2A.
Walk me through for a second. Moot the plan framework.
Like, it's an object of research, weigh something else before the fiated implementation of the plan.
Okay, so when evaluating the case, what should we do?
Or, I don't know, like weighing framework. Or like, is state bad a reason, is state bad a framework argument? Because I feel like this is arguing that it's not, and then how would you articulate that?
It is not, because the framework for is the judge evaluating whether or not we should do the thing that the AF has proposed. The should question is separate from the how are we doing it and who is doing it. All of those things are downstream of the judge needs a model that treats us as prescribers or advocates rather than observers. Note, if the neg says, well, we should be agents and advocates as well, we should have different forms of agency or different forms of advocacy, I think that we can argue that that puts us in more even terms, because then we begin to evaluate the desirability of using those different forms of agency or advocacy, which gets us back into some of these arguments about feasibility that are actually in our cards about the state. Our cards about the state do not generally negotiate this dilemma. So part of what I'm trying to say is like, this is the dilemma that you should be thinking about trying to untangle. Because in my world, we don't, as the AF, need to say something, for instance, so like, we do not need to go for an argument that utopian alts are a voting issue. We can go for a set of cards that say it is rare that radical agents succeed in revolutionizing society. We can have substantive objections to whatever alternate form of agent or advocate the negative is proposing. We don't have to theoretically exclude them. Obviously, we could make those same theory arguments, but those are theory arguments that are also not about fiat. Those are theory arguments, like, for instance, those are much more equivalent to, you would be arguing about the desirability of consultation counterplans. Like, an argument about consultation counterplans is not an argument about negative fiat. It is an argument about whether or not it is desirable to have the affirmative do what is necessary to beat the consultation counter plan. Does that make sense? And part of this also gets at the why I would try and cross-X the neg on like where they're trying to get to. So moot the plan framework, which I like my dinosaur brain can only keep up with so much of exactly the way that this terminology is being explained. But like I would primarily address that from the issue of like cross-Xing there on, I think a lot of people would ask about the role of the AF or the role of the neg and those things. Rather than ask those abstractly about role of AF and neg, I might start asking that question in terms of like, okay, moot the plan, so what does an affirmative go about doing in constructing a 1AC? Talk me through that. Because that's the set of details that I rarely hear discussed, and I don't think that most people have thought through the strategic implications of those models. They leave them implicit because the AF gets stuck over here. The AF gets stuck on state and policy making good, not on what is a model of debate in which we moot the plan. What you're trying to say there is maybe the plan, like a version of that says the plan is not the focus of debate is very different from moot the plan. Those two things are totally different. So I would focus on some of the theoretical implications of what moot the plan might entail. And yes, you are correct to say that I am saying now that like state bad is not a framework argument. It is an argument that is downstream of framework because we have to determine what the judge is deciding before we think about whether or not those particular institutions might be important means of implementing a proposal or desirable means of implementing particular proposals.
I have like a separate question.
Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about like sanctions are immoral. How should like LD kids approach like advantage areas when like those like the usual I guess conception of what we just talked about doesn't exist the same? Or doesn't seem the same.
I don't know if I have the capacity to unpack that question right now, largely because I don't judge LD. So like I don't have a great familiarity with how I would explain some of those arguments to your judging pool. I guess I raised that here just as an example of like, my impression was that LD would like ought to be a pool where you could connect those arguments a little bit more easily because the arguments about ethical or moral decision-making frameworks are something that terminology is a little bit more familiar. And like clearly policies could be defended based on the desirability of different ethical systems than consequentialism or utilitarianism. In my opinion, the AF is generally doing itself a disservice of constantly entangling state, policy-making, utilitarianism, and fiat all together and treating those as a bundle rather than treating them as separate elements that should be decided by the judge in a different sequence. So I'm sorry that I don't have the like answer to the LD question. I'll have to think about that one.
Why does separating the state and should part like resolve the tension between arguments like state good because it's unfeasible to remove the state and like desirability of feasibility?
Because you were saying that the reason that we ought to debate should in this way is to avoid status quo bias, that we need to harness the power of political imagination, that we should be thinking about different political ideas, that's where I'm talking about going to political theory to draw from that set of cards that are largely about advocacy and whether or not advocacy should accept certain constraints but also use imagination. That is an easier place to find that set of cards because the denial of any imaginary impulse in politics is one that is also that is highly contrastable with negative arguments that imply that what we need is a radical political imaginary or we need to imagine an entirely different political field. If we can say that debating should captures all of those elements together, then we have solved a lot of the offense that might be explained as a framework argument. That is that framework is too status quo biased, it assumes that we could only ever have our existing set of political institutions, etc. And rather than treating that as a theory of the judges evaluating what ought to be done, we can treat it downstream of that as part of the reason that it ought to be done in this way is that we cannot get the set of radical actors that would be necessary to agree to dismantle those institutions to succeed. Does that make sense? It's another way of thinking about this is this is a way of trying to handle the arguments or the impact arguments that are phrased as the negative arguments are pre-fiat, whereas the affirmative arguments are post-fiat, which I don't think is I have other disagreements with that theoretical terminology, but I hope it's clear why this kind of account of this would is incompatible with the notion that we could easily divide the impacts that the affirmative and the negative are talking about in terms of a theory of fiat.
So should the like state good evidence both say that it is unfeasible to get rid of the state, but it's also good for to advocate for things like
This is a little part of the reason that it's like I've said that this is also a tricky evidentiary dilemma, is like finding a set of cards that discuss this is a little different, okay? I would say that the sample card that helps resolve this dilemma is basically a card that says, here is why I advocate for things that I cannot do in immediate terms. And like those cards are, in my experience, those cards are rare, but they are oftentimes like, they draw on some notions that I think are, like, intuitive is the wrong word, but they are appealing to most people who want to think about kind of like, if you think about it, most people want to think of themselves, I think, as decision makers who, like, their actions have consequences, like the way that they approach the world matters. And part of the way that we have explained the like Fiat as decision-making skills and that set of arguments, like that is a set of things for which there are cards about like, we want to think of ourselves as agents in the world, and agents generally think about the world in prescriptive terms, or like, let me put it this way, the number of negative cards that are being used to say we can't separate between fact and value, like we are not neutral observers of the world, those are all arguments that help you prove that we ought to have a prescriptive or should-oriented model of advocacy. And so you can concede all of those arguments as part of a reason for like, desirability is an important aspect that should be captured in argument. Does that make sense? It's like, usually the neg is also reading evidence for you on that. It's just being couched differently strategically as like, discourse shapes reality or representations matter or whatever. All of those things are perfectly compatible with and in fact make a lot of sense with the idea that advocacy is very important, right? And if advocacy is the thing that we're deriving from should, and advocacy is connected to should, then all of those are cards that also demonstrate that maintaining a model of should may also be important or have important effects. To wrap it back to Cormac's question, this might be a difference between mooting the plan versus saying the plan is not the sole focus because the justifications for the plan matter, or the rhetoric that we use as advocates has important consequences as well. So then you could craft your framework interpretation in a way that preserves those benefits while getting at the kind of huge strategic deficits that accord on the different sides with a moot the plan model, as in do not consider the plan, rather than consider things in addition to the plan. Okay, lunchtime. Thank you.